Actually, I was just we ABA
Good afternoon. This hearing will now come to order. A casual examination of the usual measures of economic confidence among working families, the unemployment and inflation rates, shows that everything is just fine. The current unemployment rate of 5.5% and the inflation rate of 4.2% are a far cry from the June 1980 7.6% unemployment and 14.4% inflation. But a closer look presents a very different picture for working Americans. Consumer confidence last month came in at its lowest level since June of 1980. Only 13% of Americans rate the national economy positively, and 74% say it's getting worse, according to a national poll released just a week ago. Over the last generation, economic conditions have fundamentally changed for American families, and simple comparisons of unemployment and inflation rates fail to capture those changes. Today, American households carry debt that is equal to 132% of their disposable annual income, nearly twice the debt load, the average debt load of 68% in 1980. For the past 4 years, Americans have spent the equivalent of every penny they've earned, including what they've earned for retirement. In 1980, they were saving at a rate of 10%. The unemployment rate may be lower now, but the consequences of joblessness are likely to be dire for most Americans. Still, an illusion of well-being persists in the minds of those who cling to the traditional ways of looking at things. This mirage really obscures the profound changes in the American economy and keeps us from taking a hard look at the realities that so many of our families and communities face. Here's another statistic that would provide comfort to traditional economic viewpoint. From a traditional economic viewpoint. American manufacturing productivity rose 3.6% in the first quarter of 2008. If that is true, why are Americans so worried? Here's why. Manufacturing output actually dropped during the same period. American workers' hours dropped even more. Productivity is manufacturing output divided by the number of hours worked. That apparent positive for the economy is therefore only statistical. In reality, both output and workers' hours are down. When output and unemployment are rising, a productivity gain signifies when output and employment are rising, a productivity gain shows a robust economy. But in today's economy, it masks the fact that we are producing less of what we need and taking home less for doing it. It is obvious that we must go beyond the traditional analysis if we are to form an accurate picture of what is happening to Americans. We need to ask what the changes in the last 30 years have skewed the results of familiar economic formulas. We need to ask what is behind those changes. Finally, we need to understand how what we do know, whether it is scientific, technological, or educational, can be applied effectively to ensure that our citizens and our communities can look forward to a secure and prosperous future in this globalized economy. This hearing presents a second step along that path. On May 22nd, this subcommittee heard suggestions offered from a variety of perspectives on how to structure incentives so that American firms will maintain and expand at home in America. Today we will hear about what has happened when we have failed at this in the past, and about the effectiveness of our efforts to aid the recovery of those individuals and communities who have directly paid the price. We are fortunate to have with us witnesses who speak from a wide variety of experiences. John Russo, Dr. Russo, is an academic who has lived through and studied one of the leading episodes of deindustrialization in America, that affecting Youngstown, Ohio. Frank Morgan is an attorney who has represented displaced workers whose applications for Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA, has been denied by the Labor Department. Howard Rosen is one of the leading advocates for the TAA, who will report on the program's shortcomings and put forward a national strategy for dealing with economic dislocation. Jeanie Moore, a community college official who has played a leading role in one of the most striking community turnarounds in the country, that of Kannapolis, North Carolina. Thomas Pally is not with us yet, but we assume will be here in a short while. He is an economist who has long studied globalization and will assess our options for shaping its influence and addressing its effect. And finally, Ms. Diana Furchtgott-Roth, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. She earlier served as chief economist to the U.S. Department of Labor and as chief of staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. This is obviously a complex topic. At our last hearing, we heard completely contradictory viewpoints. Coming to grips with what it will involve is a challenging proposition. But received wisdom and long-held assumptions have to be examined and replaced sometimes with original thinking and novel ideas. But the difficulty task is no excuse for shrinking from it, and I now recognize the distinguished ranking member from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is the subcommittee's second hearing on globalization in a month. These hearings closely follow a series of 4 hearings on the same topic in the Science and Technology Committee. In addition to these hearings and over the vocal objections from the minority, the committee also hired an outside consultant and paid $20,000 for, quote, studies and advice on issues of globalization. In March 2007, Chairman Gordon wrote members of the committee and asked that they support the consulting agreement. In his letter, he argued that the consultant, Dr. Ron Hira, had unique knowledge and experience in this field that could not easily be duplicated by the committee staff. Without doubting Dr. Hira's qualifications, the minority questioned the need to hire him as a consultant. With numerous hearings planned, why not invite Dr. Hira to testify? And why did the committee have to enter into a costly consulting agreement when experts routinely testify before Congress for free? Those questions are renewed now that we have seen the majority's report. That report was due to the committee by December 31st, 2007. It was presumably delivered on time, but the minority was not given a copy until a few weeks ago, when it was made publicly available as a committee print. This print has an official look to it, just like our hearing records, and lists all of the committee members' names on it, even though half of us never saw it before it was released. The report itself is 12 pages long and includes 5 full pages of background. This report, which reportedly could not have been accomplished by the committee staff itself, is little more than a summary of the committee's hearings on this topic. I would like to enter this report into the record for taxpayers to decide if their $20,000 is well spent. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, who, like most congressional witnesses, have generously testified to appear today without charge. I must say that I have a meeting in my office with a constituent at 1:30, which I can't break, but my staff will inform me of what each of the witnesses say, and if I can make it back, I'll be happy to do so. And I ask unanimous consent that this committee print, which represents a waste of $20,000, be included in the record.
Without objection, the committee print will be entered into the record, not necessarily as a waste, but as Mr. Sensenbrenner's evidence. And I don't know nothing about it. This all has to do with something done at the committee level and not the subcommittee, but we will enter that print in the record. All additional opening statements by any member on any topic, germane or not germane, to this subcommittee's work will be included in the record, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. First, Dr. John Russo is co-director of the Center for Working Class Studies and coordinator of the Labor Studies program at the Warren G. Williamson School of Business Administration at Youngstown State University in Youngstown, Ohio. Mr. Frank H. Morgan is an attorney with the Washington law firm the Washington office of the law firm White & Case. Mr. Howard F. Rosen is the executive director of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Coalition and a visiting fellow, I'm sorry, when I'm saying I don't know nothing about it, maybe say fellow too, at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Ms. Jeanie Moore, who may be called upon to translate the chairman's remarks to the rest of those here in the committee room, is the Vice President of Continuing Education Programs at Rowan-Cabarrus Community College in Salisbury, North Carolina. Dr. Pally, thank you for joining us. Dr. Thomas I. Pally is the founder of Economics for the Democratic and Open Societies Project in Washington, and Ms. Diana Furchtgott-Roth is the director of the Center for Employment Policy and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington. You will all have 5 minutes. Each of you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony, your oral testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. When you complete your testimony, we will have questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. It is the practice of the subcommittee to take testimony under oath. although with this kind of hearing, prosecutions for perjury seem unlikely. Do any of you have an objection to being sworn in, to taking an oath? All right. The committee also provides that you may be represented by counsel, although that, again, this hearing makes that somewhat less pertinent than some of our other hearings. Are any of you represented by counsel today? If you would now all please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Okay. The witnesses all said that the witnesses all took the oath. Dr. Russo, would you now begin?
And the impact on local communities such as Youngstown, Ohio. This spring I was interviewed by more than 20 journalists from around the world on working class voting patterns and on local and state economic issues. The attention is not new. Every 4 years, reporters and candidates return to Youngstown to test conventional wisdom about economic renewal and the political responses in the face of deindustrialization. Since the 1980s, Youngstown has become the poster child for deindustrialization, losing 50,000 jobs in steel and steel-related industries. This decade, the Youngstown area has continued to hemorrhage jobs, most recently because of the downsizing in the automobile industry with Delphi and General Motors. Since 2000, in fact, the state of Ohio has experienced the worst job losses, reduced standard of living, and social disruptions associated with unemployment since the Great Depression. But what seems different this time is the reporters seem to understand what Sherry Lincoln and I wrote in our book, Steeltown, USA, that a Youngstown story in the 1980s has become Ohio's and the America's stories today. Deindustrialization undermines the social fabric of communities and nation states. The social costs of deindustrialization include the loss of jobs, homes, and health care, reductions in tax base, which lead in turn to reductions in necessary public services such as police and fire, declines in nonprofits and cultural resources, decaying local landscapes, and increases in crime both immediately and long term, increases in suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, family violence, and depression, and the loss of faith in institutions such as government, business, unions, churches, and traditional political organizations. So job losses do not affect individuals only, although it touches many who, having dedicated their lives and sometimes their health to employers, now feel betrayed and economically expendable. As one steel worker suggested to me, we are too old to work and too young to die. Rather, deindustrialization is a systemic problem that affects the identity of whole families and communities and the nation. Deindustrialization brings with it a great deal of cynicism and underlying discontent that may not be apparent to outsiders. Economic cheerleading and bootstrap journalism that labels large-scale job loss as creative destruction just reinforces a community's identity loss. When you lose your identity, other people define who you are, and you get blamed for your own situation. Nor can simple government interventions ameliorate the dramatic social costs of deindustrialization and offshoring. Attempts to revitalize our area have largely failed. Many represent what we might call the economics of desperation. Many displaced steelworkers in Youngstown in the 1980s got trained or retrained in refrigeration. There are no refrigeration jobs in Youngstown, Ohio. Between 1992 and 2000, 9% of the economic growth in the area was the result of building prisons. Youngstowners have begun to understand that the current economic thinking and political decision-making have often exacerbated these problems. For example, technologies developed with public research dollars are being used to offshore jobs. Tax incentives to multinationals are being used to export jobs. In both cases, public policy is contributing to putting hardworking Americans out of work. When challenged, many politicians and corporate leaders tender platitudes about long-range economic adjustments and suggest that displaced workers trained for jobs that either don't exist or will be moved offshore in the next wave of economic change. Increasingly, Americans understand that they are being sacrificed at the altar of economic theory. They reject the argument that deindustrialization and offshoring are part of the natural economic order, and that job losses and declining wages are an inevitable part of globalization. Instead, they see themselves as victims of conscious decisions by corporate leaders and government officials, and they are resentful. No longer will they accept the short-term solutions and amelioration efforts. While important, such approaches are ultimately ineffectual. Americans are beginning to recognize that we are in a new period of global capitalism and that the resulting problems and issues are systemic and will require systemic solutions. If we are to reach solutions, we must raise the following questions. What is the purpose of the corporation? What is the relationship between markets, corporations, and nation-states? How is international trade structured? How can trade and tax policies better reflect changes in the global economy? Anything less than serious answers to these difficult questions will be window dressing. Without serious answers, cities like Youngstown will continue to lose faith in the American dream. In summary, while we need programs that more widely share benefits and risks from globalization and offshoring, I would argue that the global economy demands new forms of corporate and international regulation that will prevent some nation states and some corporations from engaging in economic blackmail by playing one country or one workforce against another. We can no longer afford to tinker with economic and trade policy or enact reforms that are simply window dressing. Without systemic reform, growing discontent, and the incipient rebellion in American politics over globalization and deindustrialization will only grow and breed a new politics of resentment.
Thank you, Dr. Russo. Mr. Morgan.
Good afternoon, Chairman Miller and members of the committee. My primary practice area is in the international trade disputes, and I must say that my remarks today are my own and do not reflect those of my firm or its clients. And I thank Michael O'Connor and Sarah Sargentson, whose assistance made my testimony possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to offer my experience and to convey the concerns of countless frustrated workers who have unsuccessfully petitioned the Employment and Training Administration of the Department of Labor for Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA. I know this committee is considering broader and more fundamental issues surrounding globalization. Regardless of one's views on the merits of free trade, it is a no-brainer to make sure that the Department of Labor investigates each TAA claim and that workers who are entitled get prompt assistance. Congress has directed the ETA to investigate each petition and to do so with the utmost regard for the workers. In preparing this testimony, I came across a startling statistic. From 2002 to 2005, approximately 45 cases were litigated at the Court of International Trade, and in all but 4, there were reversals of labor's decision not to certify. Since 2005, there have been a further 15 cases litigated, resulting in reversals of labor's decision not to certify. Such a large number of reversals in the face of further scrutiny shows that labor is not conducting the investigation that Congress directed it to do in the first instance. And while this litigation has dragged on, labor has denied workers the relief to which they are entitled and needed. The Court of International Trade has written much about this topic, and I commend anyone who is concerned with the problem to read Judge Ridgway's decision in BMC Software, which I have attached to my written materials. My written testimony elaborates fully on the problems that exist in labor's investigation of TAA petitions, and I summarize those here today. In cases that I have litigated and those I have analyzed, the failure of labor to investigate starts at the agency level and consists of a complete failure to conduct a basic investigation beyond the 4 corners of the information provided in the petition. Often the record consists of email messages, a few email messages, and a few summaries of telephone calls. There is no excuse for this, and I practiced before many other agencies, and none of them would have none of them would call this an administrative record. This is even more disturbing when you consider the fact that labor is conducting an investigation that is not supposed to be adversarial in nature. Labor is supposed to be looking out for the interests of the workers. For TAA to serve its intended purpose, the system has to function properly at the agency level, and it will not do so until labor conducts a thorough investigation of each petition. An unsuccessful TAA petitioner at labor faces 3 options: appeal immediately to the Court of International Trade, seek administrative reconsideration, or give up. Labor sends a denial letter that informs the petitioner of their right to administrative consideration, but not of their right to seek a court appeal. There is no excuse for labor's failure to inform workers of the right to appeal, and I fear that many give up unaware of that right. For the few cases that do eventually make it to the Court of International Trade, the TAA petitioner faces a whole new round of challenges, frustration, and delay. The average case at the CIT took approximately 354 days to resolve. Contrast that with the fact that Congress contemplated that these decisions would be made within 40 days of the filing of the petition by the department. In almost every case, Labor will ask the CIT's permission to conduct what is known as a voluntary remand proceeding. In essence, Labor will go back and revisit the facts and reconsider its decision. Aside from being a tacit concession that the agency's decision isn't supported by the investigation that it conducted, it adds further delay to the process of up to 60 days or more. More disturbing, Labor often uses these proceedings as a means of bulletproofing its initial decision not to certify. This means multiple court-directed remands are necessary to get Labor to do what a reasonable decision-maker would have done from the outset. Labor engages in several other litigation tactics that cause delay, including implausible interpretations of the law and the facts. Each day of delay makes an eventual court victory less meaningful for the workers. The problems with Labor's investigations and subsequent litigation tactics are widespread. My written testimony contains excerpts from several CIT judges criticizing Labor on this score. The judiciary has done its level best, but the problem persists and has persisted irrespective of which party occupies the executive branch. So in my view, the solution requires legislative pressure and changes to the law. To conclude, the biggest problem is ETA's conduct and approach to investigations, and fixing this does not require any changes to the law. Congress simply must hold the agency accountable. Several changes to the law could help, including establishing swift and fixed timeframes, allowing for more meaningful participation by the workers and their counsel in remand proceedings, and clarifying that the CIT has the authority to order Labor to certify workers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for affording me the honor of representing the interests of hardworking men and women of America who have been failed by the very agency that Congress designated to protect their interests.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Mr. Rosen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the invitation this morning to discuss this very important issue. The U.S. economy faces intense competition from at home and abroad, and although this competition has its benefits, it places significant costs on American workers and their families, firms, and communities. Approximately 16 million jobs are terminated each year, of which 4 million result in serious unemployment. Although the probability that a worker will become unemployed has declined, the duration of unemployment has actually increased. Approximately 700,000 firms go out of business each year, affecting 6 million workers. An additional 1.7 million firms contract each year, affecting another 11.8 million jobs. About 40% of dislocated workers do not find a job within a year or two after their layoff. Another 40% who find jobs actually experience long-term earning losses. 45 counties, currently representing 500,000 workers, have unemployment rates twice the national average currently. And 20 metropolitan areas currently have unemployment rates 50% higher than the national average. Of these, 13 are in California, 2 are in Michigan, and 1 in each New Jersey, Washington, Florida, North Carolina, and Arizona. And finally, federal spending on training and employment and community development as a share of GDP has fallen sharply over the last 20 years. The country does not have a national, coherent, comprehensive strategy to deal with these economic dislocations. Instead, we have a collection of disparate, ad hoc, and inadequate programs that tend to provide assistance too little, too late. As a result, efforts to expand economic liberalization and introduce new technologies are facing significant political backlash. Over the long run, reluctance to embrace economic flexibility will cost U.S. economic growth and seriously affect U.S. living standards. If I could, let me just give you some examples of some of the problems that we have with our existing programs. Currently, only 1/3 of unemployed workers actually receive unemployment insurance. If you are lucky enough to receive that unemployment insurance, it replaces only 1/3 of your previous wage. And 1/3 of unemployed people who receive unemployment insurance exhaust their assistance before they find a new job. As you have heard, there are targeted programs like the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, and I commend Mr. Morgan for his statements that are really right on. The program, though, for those people who receive it, is quite effective. The problem is only a minority of workers receive that assistance. Programs designed to assist firms respond to competitive pressures, such as the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program for firms, they are also effective, but their funding is minuscule. The Department of Defense provides comprehensive assistance to communities that are hurt by military base closings, but there is no equivalent program for civilian dislocations. I am therefore this afternoon calling for a national economic adjustment rapid response as part of the country's broader competitiveness strategy. This national economic adjustment rapid response would be based on the following elements: comprehensive assistance to workers, firms, and communities, assisting everyone in need regardless of cause of dislocation, flexible, not one-size-fits-all, based on early intervention and coordinating public and private assistance. Let me give you some examples. Instead of providing workers a one-size-fits-all list of assistance that they must take it or leave it, we would provide a menu of assistance to workers, which would include, in addition to income maintenance and training, possibly wage insurance and a tax credit to maintain their health insurance during their period of unemployment. We could expand and build on the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and the Trade Adjustment Assistance Programs, for Firms program, and apply the base closing model to civilian economic dislocations. In conclusion, I just want to state some very basic facts. Number one, we do not live in a textbook. Markets are not perfect. The labor markets are also not completely flexible. There are transition costs. Unfortunately, many economists tend to ignore those transition costs. By contrast, I think that much of public policy is actually made to address transition costs. The debate is not over should we act or not. That debate was settled decades ago. The question is, what kind of assistance do we provide and who should we assist? The challenge is designing government-assisted programs that are cost-effective and appropriate. Mr. Chairman, the Bare Stones Adjustment Program could potentially cost the American taxpayers $30 billion, many multiples of the amount that we currently spend, or the government currently spends, to help workers, firms, and communities. If we can devote this many resources to save one financial institution, certainly we can find the resources to assist workers, firms, and communities throughout the country facing severe economic dislocation. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Ms. Moore.
Congressman Miller and committee, thank you very much for inviting me here today to share the story of our community in Kannapolis, North Carolina. Kannapolis, North Carolina was the home of Pillowtex Corporation, formerly Fieldcrest Cannon and Cannon Mills, which was the renowned manufacturer of cannon towels and sheets. The 116-year-old textile operation occupied over 9 million square feet of space in downtown, in the heart of the Kannapolis. In 2003, the company was plagued with periodic layoffs, bankruptcy rumors, and an uncertain future. Over 4,000 of our area residents were employed by the textile giant. This company closed in July of 2003. We were faced at the community college with dealing with a very unique workforce. 46% did not have a high school credential. The average age was 46. There were multi-generational job losses within families. They had limited transportation. They were psychologically and physically immobile. And the social and economic structure of their community had been completely dismantled. As of September of 2003, 42.5% were behind in their rent or house and mortgage payments. 10.6% had already gotten foreclosure notices. Approximately 93% had no ability to afford or get health insurance. Our local community college had multiple challenges in dealing with this population. We did receive a national emergency grant from the Department of Labor. It was the first of its kind directly given to community colleges. The administrative process for that grant was not well defined, which caused us some angst. Enrollment increases for community colleges in North Carolina do not generate additional funding until the year after the enrollment occurs. So having an influx of workers posed some particular economic challenges for us, even with the NEG award. There were no funds typically available for new program development. These efforts generally are absorbed in our annual operating budget. The Pillowtex enrollment demand occurred during a time when the college was already experiencing significant additional growth simultaneous with our fall registration. Capacity building efforts in terms of both facilities and human resources require additional time, energy, and dollars that were not well conceived at that time. However, at the end of the project through our fall semester of 2007, I am happy to report these results. The college provided direct services to 92% of all eligible clients in the service area. 52% of the eligible population enrolled in programs. Among the clients, the college achieved a 95% satisfaction level for its services. We did see increased enrollment in trade and technical programs which were previously under-enrolled. We did, as a college, create a comprehensive accountability plan which allowed us to track clients and the services that were provided to them. We awarded over 447 curriculum certificates, diplomas, and degrees, 460 continuing education certificates, There were multiple lessons that were learned through this process. One, first and foremost, sound decisions regarding training were difficult to make because there was an absence of jobs. Decisions were made about training during times of great stress. Basic life needs of housing, sustenance, and health insurance were a priority for the clients. Many enrolled simply to extend unemployment benefits. Compressed periods of study as in summer term did not work well with this population. Having students enroll in remedial classes simultaneous with course of study limits opportunity for success. Displaced workers lacked access and familiarity with technology. Many had a significant lack of job-seeking skills. Their wage expectations were unrealistic based on the skills that they had and the jobs that were available. College adopted an attitude of save those who you can because not everyone could be saved during this process. This was the first award directly to our colleges. I spoke earlier about administrative challenges. Our marketing materials were geared to young college students, not to adults, and many did not see that they fit into our scheme of practice. As far as the trade and legislation partners were concerned, there were lessons there. The TRA did not support programs of study leading to self-employment, even though the local economy offered job opportunities in those areas, such as real estate, cosmetology. Trade legislation restrictions regarding students enrolled in basic skills in English as a second language, there was a 52-week limit. That was not often enough time for students to progress to the levels that they needed to have sustainable skills for a new job. Advising was difficult because the trade legislation was being rewritten simultaneous with the event. We had lots of second guesses as to what we were to do or not to do. The Employment Security Commission definition of employment of $1,000 within 1 quarter does not equal sustainable wages and benefits. And there was a mechanism needed for sharing confidential information among our National Emergency Grant partners. We move forward to 2008 with what's happening in Kannapolis. Kannapolis is now the home of the developing North Carolina Research Campus. The city witnessed the demolition of the former Pillowtex site simultaneously with the construction of majestic, state-of-the-art research laboratories and facilities. Within 2 years, the campus anticipates that there will be over 2,000 research scientists and technicians employed in these early buildings. By 2032, the region is expected to realize over 37,450 jobs related to this project. The project is the dream of Mr. David H. Murdoch, the former owner of Fieldcrest Cannon, who is also owner of Dole Foods Company. Mr. Murdoch has a long-standing commitment to health and welfare of people around the world. After realizing the great potential of biotechnology to cure disease and improve health, he dedicated more than $1 billion of his personal funds to developing this campus. His vision is to create a world-class research hub where collaborative science will lead the charge for great discoveries in nutrition, health, and biotechnology research. The discovery and innovation performed at the NCRC will have a lasting effect on the way that the country and the world lives. This NCRC project is the product of serendipity for the Kannapolis community. Not everyone has a private benefactor with the means of Mr. Murdoch to come in and invest. It is the product of extraordinary vision, a unique public-private partnership with Mr. Murdoch, the state of North Carolina, the North Carolina University System, the North Carolina Community College System, and local government. It's a commitment to collaboration and innovation by economic development community, local and regional workforce partners, and educational providers K through 16. There's a requirement in this project to embrace change, diversity, and change the culture, and there's a recognition that the old economy is no longer sustainable. The characteristics of the project is designed around the principles of math, science, research, discovery, and innovation. There are state-of-the-art facilities and equipment. A community that provides infrastructure and amenities to support the concept of live, work, and play, collaboration among multiple constituencies, and a focus on health, wellness, and nutrition. An emphasis on embracing change and diversity, creating a knowledge-based economy, the globalization of business, and entrepreneurship and creativity. North Carolina has strengths in terms of economic recovery with a positive history of collaboration and partnership among its job-linked providers, the attractive quality of life, an excellent geographic location, business-friendly, a best-funded, best-organized community college system, not necessarily well-funded or well-organized, unique funding through our new and expanding industry training, focused industry training, and customized industry training that allows us to support pre-employment and skill development and customized training for job creation and development in the manufacturing sectors. The North Carolina Biotechnology Center, the North Carolina Bio Network, National Center for Biotechnology Workforce Training, emerging partnerships, collaborations with universities, a commitment to education and skill development, innovation and customization in education and training, a support of entrepreneurship and small business growth, and the ability to leverage resources and build partnerships among workforce and economic development practitioners. We have an increasing number of early college programs throughout the state, and we recognize that recovery from mass job losses is not immediate. There is no quick fix. Our current state of the region, we have continued challenge of job loss and job layoffs. We have continued unemployment and underemployment. The basic survival needs of housing, utilities, food, and transportation supersede participation in education. We have worker shortages in health care, advanced technologies, and technical occupations, and we're continuing efforts to try to bridge local workers to jobs of the future. We have engaged in constant strategies to build capacity for advanced technology in the region through partnerships, collaboration, and articulation of programs. While the NCRC has not yet produced jobs for the majority of dislocated workers from Pillowtex, we recognize that this economic recovery will be a long-term process, and we're looking forward to the future.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Dr. Pally.
Chairman Miller, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this hearing. My name is Thomas Pally, and I'm an economist. One of the subjects I have studied extensively is globalization and its impact on the American economy. Globalization has already caused significant job loss, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Since manufacturing is key for productivity growth and for producing goods to exchange with other countries, these losses put our future prosperity at risk. As globalization deepens, future job dislocations will affect a far wider swathe of the economy. However, job dislocation is just part of the story. In my view, a greater danger is that globalization threatens to permanently dissolve the social contract that has historically supported shared prosperity. Thus, globalization has already contributed to wage stagnation and rising income inequality, and that looks set to continue. So far, the macroeconomic consequences of rising inequality have been muted by rising debt and asset price bubbles that have compensated to sustain consumer demand. However, there are indications that many households have reached their borrowing limits, which augurs lower future growth. These observations illustrate the depth of the challenge posed by globalization. How our government responds will significantly impact the future opportunities of American families to participate in the American dream. That makes an understanding of globalization critical, as we are unlikely to design the right policies without it. The past 25 years have seen a stunning increase in global economic integration that shows every indication of deepening. For some, globalization is equivalent to trade, and outsourcing is merely an extension of trade as we know it. For this group, outsourcing promises significant future gains without any long-term costs for society as a whole although individuals may be economically injured. An alternative view that I subscribe to is that globalization is a qualitatively new phenomenon, with outsourcing being its latest evolution. Globalization and outsourcing could not proceed without trade, but globalization is far more than trade, and that more than anything else is the message that I would like to communicate to the committee today. That we have treated globalization as if it was trade explains why our policies have come up short. Classical free trade theory, which has driven U.S. integration into the global economy, claims all can benefit when countries specialize in producing those things in which they have comparative advantage. For this to hold, the means of production, that is capital and technology, must be internationally immobile, stuck in each country. That is what globalization has undone. Jack Welch, the former CEO of General Electric, captured the new reality when he talked of ideally having, quote, every plant you own on a barge. He envisioned factories floating between countries to take advantage of lowest costs, be they due to undervalued exchange rates, low taxes, subsidies, or a surfeit of cheap labor. Globalization has made Welch's barge a reality, creating a new world of what I call barge economics, in which the engine of trade is capital mobility rather than comparative advantage. In this new world, so-called free trade increasingly trades jobs and promotes downward equalization of wages and standards by fundamentally changing the balance of bargaining power between workers and corporations, and also by changing the margins of competition between countries. Think of two swimming pools, with the U.S. being represented by the pool with a higher water level. Barge economics joins the two pools together, causing the water to equalize at a lower level. The U.S. response to barge economics has been competitiveness policy, which advocates measures such as increased education spending to improve skills, lower corporate tax rates, and investment in R&D incentives. The thinking is increased competitiveness can make the U.S. more attractive to business. But such steps cannot anchor the barge. For instance, government can subsidize R&D spending, but the resulting innovations may simply end up in new offshore factories. Moreover, competitiveness policy can be counterproductive because it easily degenerates into a race to the bottom. For instance, if the U.S. cuts corporation taxes, other countries may match to stay competitive. The result is no gain for the U.S., while profit taxes are lowered and tax burdens shifted onto wages, which widens income inequality. Not only does barge economics undermine earlier policy tools, it also creates completely new challenges that reveal just how different globalization is from the old world of free trade theory. Barge economics incentivizes countries to adopt unfair policies to increase their relative business attractiveness. These policies include disregard of environmental damage, suppression of labor to keep wages low, direct subsidies, and undervalued exchange rates. All are visible in China, the poster child for such abuses. Another challenge is the creation of a corporation versus country divide. When corporations were nationally based, profit maximization by business contributed to national economic success by ensuring efficient resource use. Today, corporations still maximize profits, but they do so from the standpoint of their global operations. That is good for corporations, but may not be good for countries. What does this mean for policy? First, we need to continue with the collection of policies known as competitiveness policy. That means investing in public infrastructure and education and encouraging R&D spending. Second, we need to continue with traditional trade enforcement policies that must be vigorously enforced. And we need to expand and strengthen policies like trade adjustment assistance. But it is absolutely critical that we recognize that these older policies are not enough. Put bluntly, barge economics undermines the effectiveness of competitiveness policy, while increased assistance to displaced workers treats the symptoms but not the cause. Barge economics increases temptations for unfair policy and creates a wedge between corporate and national interests. These are the challenges that must be addressed, and if they cannot be addressed, the future of the American dream looks grim. Preventing unfair competition calls for global rules, which is where exchange rate rules and robust labor and environmental standards enter. Corporations know that a global economy needs global rules, which is why they have worked so hard to create global property rights. However, they have consistently opposed global rules that help workers and advance social concerns. Closing the wedge between corporation and country calls for such measures as ending preferential tax treatment of profits earned offshore, making it illegal for corporations to reincorporate outside the U.S. to escape U.S. tax laws, and new tax arrangements that encourage jobs and value creation within the U.S. Under current arrangements, VAT taxes are refunded on exports. Other countries have VAT systems while the U.S. does not, which disadvantages the U.S. Either the U.S. should adopt a VAT or VAT rebates should be abolished. Finally, we must reconsider how we finance Social Security and health insurance. These vital arrangements are financed through payroll taxes and wage benefits, increasing job costs and thereby encouraging firms to shift jobs offshore. That suggests detaching these costs from employment. The New Deal can provide an intellectual inspiration to meet this challenge. During that earlier period, we completed the integration of our national economy, creating national economic regulations and governance that prevented unfair competition between regions. For instance, Congress explicitly recognized the danger of unfair competition, which is why we have a national minimum wage. That strategy worked and created the basis for 50 years of prosperity. Now we face an analog challenge, this time to create new economic arrangements that can provide a similar basis for prosperity in a globalized economy. One certainty is that our existing trade policy frame is not up to this task. Thank you, and I will be glad to answer questions of the committee.
Thank you, Dr. Pally. Ms. Furchtgott-Roth.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today. I was so impressed with that Derek Murdoch Center. I would so much like to visit it. It has so many, it sounds like it has so many opportunities. It looked just beautiful in the pictures. Unemployment rates right now are 4.9% for men 20 and above and 4.8% for women. Despite the high oil prices, we're still not in a recession. Yet, economic disruptions are causing a loss of jobs, and we need to figure out how to deal with this. Workers are our most valuable asset, and the question is, how can we make the disruptions as little as possible? The Labor Department has many programs which are outlined in my written testimony to help unemployed workers. About 97% of workers are covered by unemployment insurance. Most unemployed workers find work relatively quickly. Last year, for example, we had about 59 million new hires in our workforce of 154 million, and we had about 57 million separations. The United States has benefited from globalization because a lot of the jobs that we export, a lot of the goods that we export create jobs for Americans. So whereas some of the jobs are lost, we create many more jobs through our export industries, particularly due to the current state of our dollar, which has made our exports very competitive. We also have lower priced goods here that make American wages go further. If you go to places like Walmart or Target, we import a lot of goods and people buy those and their paychecks go further. Some, however, can't find work because of economic disruption, and we need to find a way how to help them. So I have a few suggestions for reforming trade adjustment assistance, which is the main program to help trade-assisted workers. One thing we need to do is make it administratively simpler. It's very difficult to fill out the paperwork. The health insurance component in particular requires paying for health insurance up front and then getting a credit back the next year, and something has to be done to fix that. Also, all trade-affected workers are not all the same, and what we need to do is find individualized plans for everybody. A woman, for example, who's laid off from a Pillowtex plant isn't the same as, say, a man who's laid off from Ford or General Motors. They have different sets of skills, and they can get different sets of jobs. So we need to have the one-stop staff in the one-stop centers work individually with unemployed workers and provide individual plans for training, because they can have different kinds of training. People can benefit from different kinds of training. Require trade adjustment assistance recipients to register at one-stop centers and check computerized listings, preferably with individual guidance. We need to use high-quality measures to hold the staff at one-stop centers accountable for making sure that funds go to training that are likely to have a beneficial effect. We also need to be using more community colleges. Community colleges are a vast resource throughout our country. They can turn on a dime in terms of professors. If you have more people sign up for a class, they can hire more professors in that area. they don't have demand for a class, then that professor just doesn't teach that semester. And that's very useful, especially with regard to nurses. A lot of community colleges, for example, are constrained in terms of the amount of nurses that they can take, because nursing students they can take, because there just aren't enough people to teach it. And these are things that need to be fixed. We also need to take a close look at how we educate workers. We need to be educating workers not just for one job, but for a whole career, for a series of jobs in a career. We need to work on high school dropout rates, making these dropout rates lower, having more high school students graduate from college. I'm working on one project that looks at education in the state of Florida. Not only does Florida have a low graduation rate, but it also has a very mixed package of how classes that these students are taking. And we need to have more attention not only to having students graduate, but also to the training they're receiving. We also need to pay attention to vocational training and see if that's an option. All these things would make it easier for someone to find another job after they are laid off. What we don't need is another $9 billion program. The Trade and Globalization Act would extend TA to the service and government sectors, would certify a whole industry if just 3 firms were affected for trade adjustment assistance, or if the ITC certified that there were unfair imports. It would expand benefits to 2.5 or 3 years. It would prevent anyone except a state worker from advising a TA recipient on what kind of job to take. And this isn't anything that would benefit these workers. So I would suggest that trade adjustment assistance can be helped with a relatively small number of changes. These are changes that you members can do and help with, and that would be most helpful for these workers. Thank you very much, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. We will now have questions from the committee members, which consist only of me at this point. Rather than go through the exercise of recognizing myself for 5 minutes and then calling time on myself and then recognizing myself for another round, I'll just ask questions. If one of the other members shows up, I will call time upon myself and recognize that member for 5 minutes and proceed differently. Dr. Russo and Dr. Palley both suggested that we were in a race to the bottom. I think Dr. Palley more so in his testimony, that nations compete for investment and jobs that really use incentives like lower taxes, lower environmental standards, less expensive labor, cheaper labor, and that exacerbated was exacerbated by certain features of the international trading system. How do we address that? What can we do about it? Dr. Palley first, then Dr. Russo, and then anyone else. Dr. Palley.
Chairman Miller, I think this is absolutely right. I think the metaphor of a barge captures exactly what is going on in the economy, in the global economy. There is a tremendous increase in mobility, internationally and, of course, within our own borders. And in some sense, you could even think of the troubles before of the Rust Belt versus the Sun Belt. That was an early forerunner of what globalization is, in a sense that now spilled outside our borders. I think in some ways we're all on the same page at some level here regarding sort of the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, the details as it applies to the individual, the application to trade dislocations. I heard some difference from Ms. Fershot-Roth regarding an extension of the program to cover a broader range of workers. I myself think that is a necessary feature of helping people deal with an increasingly dynamic world. I think a job loss is a job loss, be it due to technology or due to trade, and we should therefore be extending these type of features to help workers. However, I think there's a very big difference when we look at the sort of the macro picture, the global structure of what's involved. And I think you have a problem here of how to anchor the barge and to have the barge be steered in the right direction, in a direction that produces shared prosperity. You need a whole set of programs, and that's one of the troubles when we deal with globalization from a policy standpoint. Often our policy discussions are rather siloed, as in a sense today's is. Today we approach it first from the main issue on the agenda seems to be trade adjustment assistance. But in my own testimony, I talked about the need for exchange rate rules, which has been a very, very important issue, was off when we constructed this globalized world, beginning sort of 15, 20 years ago with our sort of large trade agreements. We left trade exchange rates completely out of the picture. They're never part of trade agreements. They are clearly an absolutely essential piece of trade. More than any other factor, they probably determine the direction of trade, certainly in the short run. We need labor standards. Clearly, as we found in our own national economic development in the late 1930s, we had a whole series of pieces of important labor legislation that established the preconditions in which prosperity could be shared. And that's a challenge that we need to sort of, again, get in onto the international economic agenda. It must be part of our trade policy. Countries that don't want to participate in those type of arrangements should perhaps be excluded from participating. Environmental standards, we see that's going to be more and more part of the discussion. That was siloed off as part of sort of global warming. Now we see it has economic implications as well, because countries can compete on the margin there. I think it's very important. I know you heard in a previous hearing from Ralph Gomery about the role of bringing corporations back and realigning their interests with the national interest. What worked so well in the 1950s, that great expression, Charlie Engine Wilson's expression about what's good for General Motors is good for the country, in a sense it was an accident. General Motors was really a national corporation. It perceived its North American operations as being restricted to North America. When that was the case, it's advancing its market share in the U.S., advancing its profits here, helped advance American prosperity. Now, General Motors and lots of other corporations, of course, operate on a global basis. Where they produce is good for their global bottom line, but not necessarily for our national income. And one of the classic examples, say, is a company like Boeing. When Boeing offshores some of its components production for its new Dreamliner, that is going to take good jobs away from Seattle. On the other hand, because it can produce those pieces of componentry cheaper elsewhere, that will raise the company's bottom line. So we need incentives, and I think Dr. Gomery talked about possibly thinking about rearranging the tax code to reward companies that increase value-added production here. I think one of the obvious changes that's been on the Congress's agenda for quite a while, I know it was talked about several years ago, 5 years ago, is changing the corporate tax law so that we do not privilege profits earned offshore. A company right now that earns profits offshore pays no taxes on those profits until they are repatriated to this country. That is clearly a subsidy. It's an incentive to earn your profits offshore, keep them offshore, finance your investment out of those profits, and therefore build your production offshore. That is an easy no-brainer in my opinion. But I hope that these comments illustrate how we are talking in a sense about an architecture and not one single piece of policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pally. Dr. Russo, how do we protect our jobs, protect our prosperity without being
First of all, I think
engaged in
Dr. Pally
process
is taking care of most of the terrain that I would have discussed. And I think it's better for me just to say, let me give you an example. And this is the story of Delphi. And in our area, the subsidiary of General Motors was Packard Electric, that during the late 1970s had 14,000 jobs and started moving its work, first of all, to the maquiladora sector in Mexico, and became the largest employer in the maquiladora sector. The workers and the union there negotiated three-tier wage levels to make sure they retained as many jobs as they possibly could, and there was discussion that this was all part of an international divisions of labor within the company. It made sense economically. As this moved on into the 1990s, they continued to move jobs to Mexico and then starting to deindustrialize parts of their sections of Mexico when they found out the wages became $2 an hour, that they can get the jobs done at 20 cents an hour in China. when they were spun off from General Motors, they continued their moves offshore, and ultimately they went into bankruptcy. In an attempt to abrogate their collective bargaining agreements, to use the PBGC, if necessary, as a threat to force General Motors to accept their pensions. And while all this is going on, and they're in bankruptcy, one business editor called me and says, well, why don't the workers take more concessions? And I said, first answer your question for me, how does a company in bankruptcy at that time have a stock value of $3.50? Because investors know that Delphi is a global corporation, and they've secured their assets in China in the Eastern Automotive Triangle. And while they're in bankruptcy in the United States and in North America, what they're doing is they're building a $350 million R&D facility that will hire 3,000 engineers in Shanghai. And when we were when I was speaking at Peking University, this whole question, what is Delphi? What is a corporation? Okay, what is the purpose of a corporation? Is it just an entity that is involved with increasing shareholder values and moving inputs and assets around like pieces on a chessboard? Or is a corporation an organization that has reciprocal responsibilities with shareholders and managers and employees and the nation states in the creation of value? I think that crucial question that was, part of the first hearing is very central to this discussion, not just of simple economic policy, but of policy of what is a corporation.
President.
With your permission, Mr. Chairman, if I could just very briefly, I want to respond to your question in a bit of a different way, which is, what should we not do? And the first thing is, we need to invest in this country. Currently, investment in plant and equipment as a share of GDP is very low. It's below its 50-year trend. So we need to invest more in this country. We ourselves need to do more. Number two, we need to have international agreements on trade and taxes and investment and all of those things. And instead, over the last 8 years, we've pursued a policy of going after bilateral agreements. We've spent a lot of time negotiating these agreements that amount to something like 8% of our trade at the expense of our multilateral agreements, which now are basically at a standstill, and we're not even sure if they're going to be completed. So first thing is we don't invest enough. Second of all, we've had a misguided trade policy over the last 8 years. And the third are the issues that we're raising this morning in terms of how do we assist in the transition. They are not the answer, but they're part of the answer. And we don't do that right either. And ironically, what we're doing is, at some sense, we're strengthening the targeted programs that only help a certain few number of people, and the general programs are weakening. And one last comment I just want to say, because I think it's always important to put all this in context. We talk and talk and talk about trade adjustment assistance. Currently, only 50,000 people in this country are enrolled in the program. We're not talking about a program that is, that is helping thousands and millions of people, like unemployment insurance. It's 50,000 workers. And it gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of resources because of the political importance of those people. But why are we only helping those people that way and not other people?
Scott Roth, did you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. You asked, are we in a race to the bottom, and what should we do about it? And I would like to say we're not in a race to the bottom. We've had more globalization, but we're better off. I mean, if you look at where we are now compared with, 30 years ago, we have more globalization, but we have a lower unemployment rate. We have lower inflation. People are better off. People have cell phones, computers, DVDs. This little BlackBerry that made such a splash when Al Gore used it in 2000. So many people have them now. People eat out more. The houses that are built have air conditioning and heating. We have Toyota, BMW, Nissan with plants here in the United States producing more jobs for American workers, and countless other foreign plants here also creating jobs. You ask what should we do about it? Well, one thing we should do to improve our economy, we should keep tax rates low. Tax rates are scheduled to go up on the 1st of January 2011. I've just written a book that's been published by Lexington Books called Overcoming Barriers to Entrepreneurship in the United States. Just came out a couple of months ago. Tax rates are important to entrepreneurs. Many of them file under individual tax rates. Their tax rate's scheduled to go up from 35 to 40%. I mean, it's no wonder investment in the United States, as Mr. Rosen said, is declining if we're facing such a large tax hike in 2011. We need to do something about our energy. Our manufacturing sector is affected by our energy. Our airline industry is affected by energy. We need to be drilling offshore and in Anwar. We need to be building refineries and nuclear power plants. We can't look on energy as this dirty stuff that we don't need, because our manufacturing sector needs it. We need to get rid of the ethanol mandate that's driving up food prices. Eggs cost about $2 or $3 a carton. I bought corn yesterday. It was 3 ears for $1, and it used to be 5 or 6 ears for $1. Milk, it's $3.50 a carton, a gallon, used to be $2 a gallon. We need to get rid of that ethanol mandate, which is going to require 36 billion gallons of ethanol in 2022, 9 billion this year, and we just don't have the corn to deal with that. And we need to pass more free trade agreements, as Mr. Rosen said. We need to pass the Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Right now, the Colombians can import anything they like here under the existing trade agreements, but we cannot export over there, and so our companies don't have markets for in Colombia, and those need to be opened up. So thanks very much for asking that question.
Thank you. Are average wages keeping up with inflation?
If you look at average wages in terms of benefits, total compensation,
that assumes in healthcare costs.
Right, exactly.
But
wages without benefits
right.
Are not keeping up with inflation, but benefits are a more and more important component of total compensation.
Because of the inflation of healthcare costs?
Because of the higher cost of healthcare, yes, and the higher cost of pensions.
Okay. Dr. Russo, you, and I think Dr. Pally too, echoed what was said at our last hearing about the role of corporations and how they should not perhaps just be judged by their profitability, but there are other obligations other than just the obligation of the shareholders. In fact, most corporations are not run for the shareholders either; they're run for the top top executives. My question then and now is that is a remarkable change in the way we look at the economy. If we expect the major economic actors, the largest corporations, not to act on essentially one criterion, profitability. If we take the view that corporations, and trying to make corporations national institutions again instead of international institutions is no small feat, but if we assume that they should pay attention to the concerns of the communities and that in which they locate operations and their workers, and on. How do we judge? How do we judge the performance of the management of the board of directors? How do we hold them accountable? How do we govern corporations when there is this wide set of considerations in how corporations should behave and how their performance should be judged? Dr. Russo?
I think it's a complicated question because we're really rethinking corporations, right, because they've already rethought themselves. At an earlier period of time, they did take into account multiple stakeholders in terms of their thinking, and some corporations still do that. But increasingly, as one executive said to me, I want to do the right thing. But in this competition, this global competition now, I'm going to have to move offshore. I'm going to have to downsize. And so the answers to the questions are really sort of systemic. How we look at global corporations in a global economy, how we define what they are as legal entities and their various responsibilities, how we judge their interactions with nation states, because the nation states provide a framework for their operations. And that's going to require a type of discussion that's going to include not only the United States, but other countries, in a discussion about how do we hold these corporations responsible for their actions.
Dr.
Thank you.
Powell, did you?
This is a very deep question.
Well, thank you.
No, and of course, I know I did read the transcript of the previous hearing, and my Dr. Margaret Blair, who was at graduate school at Yale with me, I saw a presenter, and she did indeed sort of point out how the right to be a corporation is indeed a legal privilege. It's created by law. It's not something that exists naturally. And Dr. Blair also pointed out that, in fact, in current U.S. law, there is nothing that says profit maximization is the only goal of corporations, though apparently there is one small state case regarding a bankruptcy when the firm was clearly going to be put into bankruptcy. At that stage, it did seem to have an obligation to do best by shareholders. I also want to reiterate what Dr. Russo said about, I've spoken to corporations too, corporate executives who say how they are trapped in this system. And that's when I use the word, this race to the bottom. I don't want it to be we're all going to end up impoverished here in Bangladesh. That's not going to happen. We're a rich society, and we will continue to be rich. But whether we're as well off as we could be is a different question, and that's the sort of way in which I use it. And lots of corporate executives, responsible corporate executives, would like to do better, but are trapped in this situation. And so we can truly help them. One of our problems here is we tend to think of ourselves as engineers, as if we can engineer society. As an economist, that's not my frame of mind. I think it's getting good outcomes from the economy, from society, is extremely difficult. I would point to one thing, again, coming back to this issue of an architecture, or think of an economy as a house. A well-designed house has doors, windows, ceilings, floors. You need all the pieces together to make a well-designed economy. And here is something at how we've hurt ourselves, I think. I think of unions. Unions were a critical way of negotiating this difficult thing of getting corporations to behave responsibly. When there was a strong union movement in this country that was supported by public policy, not been now for close on 40 to 50 years, unions fought for people within the corporation to get these other goals onto the corporate agenda. Once you drove unions out of existence, not out of existence, you drove them into a great state of weakness, you lost that form of representation. And so today corporate governance has taken a different direction. And a very interesting study that I saw referred to, I don't actually have the citation here right now, is there was some economists who looked at pay of CEOs and the connection to union presence. And it turns out when unions are present, CEO overpayment is much, much less. So you do see not just representing workers, but unions bringing in other social interests, and this is done in a sort of a non-legislated way. And that's the sort of thing how Congress, with labor law, can then have a knock-on effect in terms of good corporate governance in a way that one wouldn't anticipate.
And the presence of other CEOs on the board's compensation committee also has a correlation to executive pay.
Yes, indeed.
It results in much higher executive pay. Mr. Rosen.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I just want to come back again to some specifics to help you. You know, we talk about labor standards and environmental standards in other countries. We don't talk about them here in the United States. And this is something that could be done without legislation. If we could kind of have a good seal of housekeeping for our companies, which of our companies invest, how much do they invest in R&D as a share of their sales? How many of them provide pensions and health care to their people? If we had this ranking, how much do they reinvest their profits here in the United States? If there was an organization that would to list these things, we would know who are the good companies, if you will. And then those companies would get some attention. Maybe then people would invest in those companies. So those are standards that we could do right now. We wouldn't need any additional legislation. But we're so busy talking about what others should do, and we forget to see what we should be doing.
How does that affect, Mr. Rosen, or any of you who've already answered this question, corporations are now, the large corporations are now not simply national entities in the way that General Motors was in the 1950s. They truly are international. Their investors are international. Their markets are international. Their operations are international. What would investors in other countries think of a measure of a corporation that looked at how well it's doing by people in our country?
Well, first thing my response I'd say is that I know that in places like Germany and Japan, that does affect their own investors to invest in those companies that they think are going to be loyal companies to their countries. We just don't have that kind of investment strategy. We don't encourage that kind of investment strategy, and in part because we don't have the information. So I think we could, here in the United States, we could influence the markets, the capital markets with that kind of information. What would other investors in other countries think about it? I would imagine that they'd like it because it would be providing more information to them also. Part of the problem right now is we don't get good information about these companies for investors, and that would help everyone. I think all investors around the world would appreciate it.
Dr. Pally.
Yeah, could I chime in there as well? This may be anecdote, but it is a story that I heard that Ralph Nader actually wrote to the CEOs of the top 500 corporations in this country and asked if they could say the Pledge of Allegiance before their board meetings. And their response was, in fact, that one, I think, wrote back that he might consider it. The other 499 said that they couldn't because they had international shareholders who were obviously didn't share that same interest. I think that reveals something very important. I'm all for standards, sunlight, exposure of what corporations are doing, but I don't think you'll be able to escape the fact that at some level one will need powerful legislation and obligations of corporations. That those obligations, again, imposed in part by law or through other actors in society who are powerful or remade powerful, such as unions. I do want to say that one very important thing here, and I strongly disagree with Ms. Bershot-Roth's recommendations that we pass further trade agreements like the Colombian trade agreement. What is going on here is we are going down a road that locks us in and makes it further and more difficult to change direction. That is one of the consequences of building public policy in this piecemeal way. And I am therefore a strong supporter of the idea of taking a pause in trade agreements, taking them off the table, beginning a period of powerful introspection, and we look at what things we can do alone, what things we can do with other countries, then work with those other countries to see who's on board for making changes, and to try and escape the path on which we are currently locked into.
Ms. Bershot-Roth.
Thank you. Yes. Well, to answer your question about corporations, we need to make the United States a hospitable place to be. So the corporations are attracted to the United States. We need to have low tax rates, low levels of regulation, low energy prices. After we passed the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, recently London has overtaken New York by some measures as a financial center. And we can't legislate that corporations stay here in our internationally mobile economy. But we can make it a hospitable place where corporations want to locate, where they can, where they provide jobs for Americans, where they provide low-cost goods, and that should be our goal.
British law allows or requires a advisory vote by shareholders of executive compensation. The United States does not. Do you believe that that would be an improvement?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. You cited favorably Britain.
Yeah.
That some of our corporations were moving more operations to Britain.
Right.
Britain has requires a vote by shareholders at least on executive compensation packages. An upward is actually not entirely advisory. It's either approve or disapprove. The United States does not have anything like that. Do you think that would be a useful reform in the United States?
Oh, no, I don't think it would be.
Okay. The Department of Defense, in their base closings, took some great efforts to try to lessen the impact on the communities that they were reducing or eliminating military operations in, closing bases. There have been some suggestions, and have for a long time, that American corporations should have to do the same thing. Do you think something like that would be useful, and what form do you think it should take? Mr. Rosen, you seem to be
Yeah, thank you
reaching
very
for-
much. Here's a case where we have a positive model, and it works, as you suggest. The question is, why are we only letting a few communities take advantage of it and not others? Let me just say, I actually had the honor of having the opportunity to experiment with this program in a civilian case. I was working for a senator, Senator Bingaman, and the state of New Mexico was experiencing severe dislocations because of Levi Strauss plant closings. And we tried to emulate the base closing process in Roswell. We got one of their technical advisors transferred to Roswell to help with writing a strategic plan. We made up a community board just like they do under base closing, and it was pretty successful. Now, of course, none of these efforts are ever going to make all of these workers whole again. We know that, but the question is, can we kind of ease the transition a little bit more? And the base closing, model is a successful one. What makes it successful is that it is kind of aggressive. So they send expertise to the communities and help them figure out where they want to go. Number two, they know about existing government programs, not necessarily calling for more programs. They know where the grants and loan programs are, so they can help communities apply for those programs. That's the problem. A lot of communities and workers don't know about these things, but there are a lot of programs out there. So that's the second thing that they do. And the third is it's very comprehensive. They look at everything. They look at the education system, the employment system, attracting new companies. They look at the whole thing. It's not just a worker adjustment program. So those three elements makes it very successful. And to be quite honest, I just don't understand at this stage, when this program has been in place for several decades, why we don't use it in civilian cases. I just don't understand. And it wouldn't be that costly. It's not a question of money, because all it would be is that it would be funding the technical assistance, because it's already the existing loan and grant programs. So I don't think it's a matter of costs.
My time has now expired.
First time.
Mr. Bayard is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and I thank our panelists. This is something tremendously important to my region. I have a county that's carrying 9% unemployment, leading our state in that, and at least a significant portion, we believe, competition from international trade. One of the issues that many of us turn to when such events happen is trade adjustment assistance. And Mr. Morgan, you've commented on the numbers of cases that have been filed and then denied and then litigated and then approved. And you believe basically that DOL doesn't seem to be on the side. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. From as you read it, it just doesn't sounds like their default answer tends to be no, and that leaves a whole lot of American workers bereft of the benefits that we created this program for. Could you comment a little further on that? I've read your testimony, and any others who want to add to that, I'd appreciate. What is the situation? What do we need to do to improve it?
I think you're exactly right, that the problem is that the department's default answer is no. Now, they would surely come back and say that they certify workers in a lot of cases, but I think that what they're doing is certifying workers where the petition presents such a compelling, straightforward case that they don't have to conduct any kind of an investigation. The cases where they're denying relief and then going into court and defending that decision, they've conducted the scantest of investigations. And just to kind of compare, I do a lot of work at the International Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce, the International Trade Administration. The agency records in those cases are always going to be far more extensive, but I've never seen a case where one of those agencies tried to defend a decision on a few emails and a few voicemails. And I think what it's going to require from Congress is to bring the agency in and to ask them and to hold them accountable for the fact that they're not conducting the kind of investigation. I mean, Congress has given the agency subpoena authority to produce documents and witnesses. I've never seen that even level of concern in these investigations. And then when they go into court, and I think a lot of agencies do tend to do this, they reflexively try to defend the decision that they reached on the first instance. But in the other agencies where I practice in front of, those are adversarial proceedings where the parties have hired lawyers and have had full representation throughout the administrative process. And the agency in those cases does not have some kind of protective interest towards one side or the other. They're supposed to administer and enforce the law. In labor cases, they're supposed to be acting with the interests of the workers in mind, and the workers don't have counsel, especially at the agency level. So I think that they're just completely acting in disregard of the congressional mandate to protect the workers.
Mr. Rosen, please.
Yeah, Congressman Bard, I just want to add, I always think it's important to put all of this in context. I think Mr. Morgan has set out really excellently the problem. Just some numbers. Every year, the Department of Labor receives approximately 3,000 petitions for trade adjustment assistance. They certify approximately 2,000 of those petitions. As he suggested, some of them are very slam dunk, they're very easy, and 1,000 of them get denied for whatever reason, legitimate, mistake on the form, whatever reason, 1,000. As Mr. Morgan pointed out, only 12 of those 1,000 are ever appealed. People don't understand how to do it. It's a very arduous process. So let's make sure we understand. I mean, there are egregious problems with the appeal process, but it is only affecting a minority of people. And I just want to give you one example. I run a nonprofit organization that helps workers navigate through the program. We finally set up this organization because the Labor Department wasn't doing it. This is a true story. I received a phone call yesterday from a gentleman in Indiana. He missed the orientation meeting at the One Stop, and the state denied him assistance. Now, how is that a way to run a dislocated worker assistance program, let alone a trade policy at which trade adjustment assistance is at the center of that trade policy? Because the guy missed the meeting. So we've really got to rethink this whole thing. I mean, we've got serious problems, and I've studied this program for 25, 30 years. I have to say that it is not a partisan issue. It is not a partisan issue. And I think part of the problem is because the Labor Department doesn't like running targeted programs. They would much rather run a general program because it's much more cost effective to do that. I think, I don't know the numbers, but I think that there are probably more people at the Department of Labor working on trade adjustment assistance than there are working on unemployment insurance because it's such a highly bureaucratic program. So on the one hand, I kind of understand the problem at the Department of Labor, but that's not the fault of the workers who need the assistance.
Any others want to comment on that from your experience?
I'd like to share that when we were working with folks from Pillowtex, we had roughly 1,000 of the 4,900 that were affected in the state who just fell off the map. We never heard from them. We never got any response from them. The system itself was so complicated and so overwhelming that it was not unusual when we were in the rapid response meetings for workers to literally get up, walk out, and just dump the materials in the trash can because they didn't have any way of understanding. When you're talking about an illiteracy rate of 46%, you hand people a stack of materials like this that they're supposed to go through and navigate and understand and complete, it was just impossible. So it is a very user-unfriendly application process for those men.
Very helpful because, many of us who believe that the trade has, my state in particular is the most trade-dependent state per capita in the country, Washington State, with Boeing and Microsoft and Weyerhaeuser and all the grain and whatnot that goes to Washington. So we, in many ways, benefit from trade, but at the same time, as I mentioned, I've got workers who have lost their jobs, I think, directly related to trade. And one of the things those of us who try to support responsible trade policies do is we look at TAA to sort of buffer that. But from what you're saying, at multiple levels along the way, that imagined buffer may break down, both in terms of the application for the eligibility itself, for the initial job loss, and then for the workers who then apply and may, if they miss a meeting, may lose their eligibility, but also they come to the meeting and they just get overwhelmed by the bureaucracy. I think, Mr. Chairman, one thing we might want to do, both on this committee and more broadly in the Congress, is look at that. I have some more questions I'd be happy to ask, but I know my 5 minutes is up. So,
Mr. Baird, I went over 5 minutes a little bit myself. If you'd like to continue, you may.
Yeah, then if that's the case, then I'm particularly interested in issues of service jobs and how that relates to TAA and also to trade. I founded in this Congress a Career and Technical Education Caucus, and I believe we don't do enough on career and tech ed. Part of the reason I did that was I think it's harder sometimes to export some of those jobs. We're going to be needing plumbers, and hard to outsource a plumber. But a lot of our service jobs, which many of us have sort of told people, boy, that's the area where you can strike it rich and make big money, etc. Those things are getting more and more outsourced. And I wonder if any of you have comments on pros and cons and how we help deal with that potential job loss related to trade.
I think it's a great question, and I guess more or less my role here partly is to give it sort of a historical sort of background on this. The dislocations that were going on in Youngstown among steel workers, nobody really gave a damn because those were blue-collar workers. Okay? This was all part of the natural economic order, creative destruction, all the usual sort of ideas out of traditional economic theory. And like you said, people were promised future jobs. They were going to computer repair. That was a short-term solution because you just slipped in a new piece of equipment. But what happened is that in the 1990s, especially in Ohio, we started to see the outsourcing of service jobs. Middle-class white-collar jobs, not middle-class blue-collar jobs. And then somebody kept coming back to Youngstown and say, well, did you guys ever recover? And the answer is no. But they were being told the same thing that our communities were told in the 1980s. We jump forward today, and you see a tidal wave of this information, as I say in my remarks. There's a growing politics of resentment, a sense that they don't trust anybody because these platitudes, these jobs they're being traded for, their experience with trade adjustment, knowing full well that often these jobs will be outsourced more quickly. How much productivity can we educate into a worker that's going to be offset by a job in China that can be done with 5 people making 50 cents an hour? I'll repeat what I said in my remarks. These are systemic discussions, systemic resolutions, and with no disrespect to my colleagues here, they're talking about trade adjustment. They're talking about community college and retraining. I think, and the lack of the Department of Labor, which you are absolutely right to talk about, who more or less cover the getaway of corporations that are now have a policy to move work increasingly to the areas that have the lowest wages. So, to get back to your point, this situation is not going away, and it's only being exacerbated by what's happening today.
Yes, Mr. Congressman, when I started my career about 25, 30 years ago, the growth industry was trying to calculate how many workers were losing their jobs in manufacturing because of trade. The growth industry now is trying to calculate how many service workers are going to lose their jobs because of globalization. It's not an easy thing to do, and there are a lot of people that are doing it, coming up with enormous numbers. Problem is, I think the reason it's getting attention is because our policy infrastructure hasn't caught up with the economic reality. So, for example, we have this Trade Adjustment Assistance Program with all of its problems. But I'll give you another case in point because I think it's always important to talk about the specifics. There was a very major case in your state that was taken to the Court of International Trade because the workers, they made software, and the Department of Labor did not give them eligibility. And then finally the case was argued in the court, and they said, well, because the software is put on a CD, then we can consider the CD a product. But otherwise we can't. Now, I mean, who draws these lines? The persons who do software that isn't put on a CD still experience job loss the same way as the worker who provides it, who does come on a CD. So this kind of problem is, like I said, it's our infrastructure having a hard time catching up to the economic reality. Thus, the House of Representatives has passed a trade adjustment assistance bill that expands TAA to services. Now, it's going to cost some money. I'm sorry, it's just the reality of it. And so we're thinking of ways, we're trying to come up with ways to be able to target the program to really help those people in need. Granted, some of the service workers have higher education, have more background. They may not need the same kind of assistance as others. But we should get around this discrimination and at least try to deal with the problem before it comes and it bites us. And I just want to repeat something I said in my statement, which is, well, this is all important because, A, we want to help workers in need, clearly. But I believe that this frustration is starting to infiltrate our ability to make economic policy. We're not able to move forward on trade policy. We're not able to move forward on policies that will create economic change. Greenhouse gas emissions. People are talking about what kind of dislocations is that going to create. If we had in place a structure that helped everyone equally, adequately, then we might be able to move forward on some of these economic policies more efficiently.
Thank you, Mr. Baird. Ms. Moore, I get homesick sometimes, so I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more. The period from 2001 to 2005 was the worst four-year period of job loss since the 1930s, since the Great Depression in North Carolina. We lost 167,000 manufacturing jobs, which is almost a quarter of the state's manufacturing jobs. Our community college system is one of the best in the nation, the third largest. Thank you, Terry Sanford. And we have, unlike many states where the community college system essentially began as a academic program, ours is much more of a history of job training, being very specifically targeted to economic skills. But for a lot of community colleges, the need was overwhelming. Obviously, they placed more than Kannapolis, but Dr. Russo talked about in Youngstown, workers getting training in refrigeration when there are no refrigeration jobs. The part of my district that is probably closest to the kind of job loss you suffered in Kannapolis is Rockingham County, north of Greensboro, Eden, Reedsville. That probably had the second largest number of Pillowtex jobs all lost on that same day. And I've certainly heard there of displaced workers wondering whether the programs they were taking at the community colleges under TAA matched up to any jobs that were going to be available to them. What kind of challenges do the community college system for North Carolina as a whole face during this last few years, this last decade? And what lessons can we learn from the experience of the whole community college system?
I believe that for us at Rowan-Cabarrus Community College, and I think Rockingham experienced a similar dynamic, we saw our displaced Pillowtex workers going into trade programs that previously had been under-enrolled. They were previously under-enrolled. Okay. They were programs that literally were dying on the vine. As I think Dr. Russo made reference to the blue-collar jobs, many folks were migrating away from those because they didn't believe that they could make a sustainable living in those kinds of work environments. So the Pillowtex phenomena actually gave us at the college an opportunity to revitalize some of those trade programs and technical programs. These were programs where we were hearing from local employers we were not producing enough graduates. We weren't producing enough machinists, enough welders, enough auto technicians. So that healthy boost, and the heating and refrigeration. The Charlotte market, which of course is 40 miles south of us, absorbed many of those folks into jobs that were applicable to those trade programs. But I hear, and I know it's a very deep concern of our new system office president, that there are programs throughout the state in community colleges that are closing because of a lack of enrollment. So there are there is a skilled labor shortage. We have programs that address those skilled labor needs. However, because of not being able to get people into those programs or to keep up with the technology that's out there in those service sectors, we're struggling to maintain those programs in the state of North Carolina.
Can I respond to that also?
Dr. Rousseau.
Because the experience in Ohio was pretty similar to that. Let me give you some examples. In the 1990s, I was asked to do a research project for the Western Reserve Building Trades Association, which is the contractors and the unions in Northeast Ohio, and what was happening to their particular industry 15 years into the deindustrialization that was going on. And what I saw was union contracts that were only on paper alone. Everybody was signing what were called project agreements that had lower wage levels. And when asked about this, we were told that it was the result of all the ex-steel workers that were going into construction. In other words, anybody who had a pickup truck and a toolbox went into construction, became part of the underground economy. They became low-wage workers. They lowered the scales of unionized workers that are plumbers. Meanwhile, in that industry itself, that workforce was graying. And there was a lot of intergenerational work in the construction industry, and people were not going into construction, the children of these construction workers, because employment had become episodic. And so the deindustrialization process does not only impact the particular industry, but it also impacts a set of subsidiary industries in lowering their wages and benefits. And then you have, at the same time, you have workers who may have been making a manufacturing wage or being asked to take service jobs. As one steel worker said to me, you know, I went from working in McDonald's steel to McDonald's hamburgers. And what happened? The wages dropped dramatically, and they had to struggle to survive. An earlier question that you had about the experience of these working people, and what you rightly, suggested, is that they disappear because of the emotional, the economic conditions that they experience at the time of that unemployment. And it's hard for people to understand. They can't concentrate if they wanted to. There's economic necessity. There's a whole set of pathological problems that become associated with the unemployment, and they disappear. Out of sight, out of mind.
Very quickly, a problem with that the community colleges face, and that's capacity. As you yourself mentioned, here Kannapolis experiences this enormous number of layoffs, but maybe had not done that in 20, 30 years. So there's a community college that's based on a certain number of enrollment, and then all of a sudden their enrollment goes up by 3 or 4 or 5 times, and the community college is being asked to respond to it immediately. So there's a capacity problem of just basically room, furniture, equipment, teachers, and that has to be done immediately, and in part because for economic reasons it should be done immediately, but also because our programs are geared such that you've got to be through them within a certain amount of time. So that's a real problem that the community colleges face, and that's something that we need to respond to. Now, let me just say that in the trade adjustment assistance legislation that's being considered, there is some thought about the possibility of a grant program for community colleges, because this isn't something that every college is going to experience all at the same time, but different colleges are going to experience at different times. And there's an example of something that could be done to really help the problem.
Ms. Moore.
I'd like to also add one of the issues that we faced in absorbing so many adult workers was the remedial needs of those folks in terms of not only English and math, but technical issues. Because you can't take an English class, very few classes can you take at a community college anymore where you're not required to have some computer application skills. You have to be able to apply online, you have to be able to register online, you have to be able to complete a research paper or a report using a computer and a flash drive. These were foreign elements to this workforce, so you have that whole issue of remediating the adults so that they can compete in the same classes as recent high school graduates who come to us with those skills. So that's another burden.
in most of rural North Carolina, and actually it's the community colleges that maintain these statistics, the percentage of the adult population that does not have a high school diploma or GED is typically in the high 20s or even in the 30s. And for those folks to lose their jobs in their 40s or their 50s and to be too old to work and too young to die, it's pretty hard to go back to school. Ms. Moore, Dr. Russo talked about the emotional toll that displacement took on people. How it's hard to concentrate, hard to do what needed to be done next to create a new economic future for yourself. Have you observed those kinds of difficulties with displaced workers? And what suggestions do you have for community colleges or the communities that find themselves in a similar circumstance in the future?
We certainly experienced that in a very big way with Pillowtex, and we continue to experience it with the ongoing dislocations that we have. When folks are traumatized, it was almost like seeing folks suffering post-traumatic stress syndrome because they had lost their livelihood, and as I alluded earlier, many were multi-generations within the same family, so son and daughter couldn't go live with mom and dad couldn't go live with son and daughter because they were all impacted by the same plant closing. The emotional attachment that people felt to that way of life and to that industry persisted for a number of years, and I think there are still elements within our community who believe that there will be some semblance of Pillowtex that resurrects itself on the research campus because that's what they see as that site, and was there for 116 years and sustained many of them and their families, and they think it will come back in some way, shape, or form. One of the real issues that we had was that our own faculty and staff who were dealing with these dislocated adults did not have any previous kind of training or experience that prepared them to talk with these folks and counsel them and advise them. Our partners, our JobLink partners, came together. We tried to work as cohesively as we could. One of the issues with the influx that we had were that the local employment security commissions hired a lot of intermittent workers. These were workers who were as unfamiliar with trade policies as the community college folks were. So we were educating ourselves not only on the policies but also on the emotional issues that these folks were coming to us. If someone came in, they were about to be evicted because they couldn't pay their power bill. We had to figure out a way to find them some kind of resources. Had one gentleman who came to us who was reluctant to go out and look for a job because he had a mouthful of teeth that were in very, very bad condition, and he had no dental insurance and no way of getting those treatments. We had people that were suffering from pre-existing medical conditions who needed surgeries that had been scheduled, and they no longer had an insurance provider to do that. And then they were being told, well, you have to be enrolled in school and you have to be enrolled within X period of time or you're going to lose your extended unemployment. So there was a lot of trauma that was going on, a lot of really, really difficult human decisions that were having to be made with a very limited professional level of guidance and counseling resources available to them.
I want just to add to that story, but not to the workers, but to the mental health workers. One thing we read about in our book, Steel Town, USA, is a case at Parkview Counseling Center in the 1980s where they were having employment problems. I came in there to see what the employment problems. We did a needs assessment, and then we interviewed all the psychologists. And I remember going back to the meeting with about 40 psychologists and about 50 staff, and saying to them what they needed to do was group therapy. Now, it was interesting to tell a group of therapists they needed group therapy. But what was happening to them is that they were suddenly handling this influx of mental health cases that were not the usual marital disputes. It's, hello, I'm going to kill myself, I want to kill my kid, you know, I'm having all sorts of problems. And there was an overload of, their caseloads exploded without any additional resources. In fact, as the community downsized, the amount of money that came into these mental health institutions was decreased because it was based on a per capita formula. So the mental health workers, the caseworkers in those institutions were overwhelmed by this deindustrialization. It was another part of the story. It wasn't just the actual workers or the university, but it was also the mental health caseworkers who had to deal with this fallout from deindustrialization.
My time has expired, and speaking of psychologists, the chair now recognizes Mr. Baird.
Thank you. He meant that because I am one, not because I need one, although that latter may also be.
The two are not inconsistent.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm interested in the issue of one of the things we discovered in work in my district was, paradoxically, in normal student loans, part-time students are not eligible for student loans. It seems to be really doesn't make any sense, and we actually have some legislation that we've introduced to try to fix that. How does TAA assistance relate to part-time students?
Mr. Congressman, that has also been a problem in trade adjustment assistance. Currently you must be enrolled in full-time training in order to receive the assistance. Again, the piece of legislation that was passed by the House and is currently being considered in the Senate would address that problem and try to deal with the part-time issue. It would also, because this came up earlier, let me just take this opportunity to say, try to address this issue of self-employed. I mean, currently, you can't get assistance if you're going to be self-employed. So there's an attempt to try to do it. All of these things are not so easy. We don't do it because we just decide not to do it. It's just hard to do these things. But, you know, people have to come together and try to come up with solutions. The part-time work is a problem because people can't afford to just stop everything and take training. I mean, we in Washington come up with these great ideas, but the reality is that these people just can't do that. So hopefully if this legislation passed, and I think you all know that there are a lot of hurdles before this legislation, if it does pass, it will be an attempt to try to address that. But I also want to make one comment on what Ms. Furchtgott-Roth mentioned about the non-high school or the high school dropouts. This is a very serious issue. By my calculation, there are 50 million people in this country that do not have a high school degree or a GED equivalent. 50 million. And yet we come up with all of these programs for college-bound students. Why don't we make those programs available to those 50 million? Or why can't we say that as a nation within the next 10 years, we're going to make an objective that no one in this country will not have either a high school degree or a GED equivalent. And let's put in some of those resources that we devote to college-bound students to making sure that every student in this country gets a GED or a high school equivalent. And again, currently, that is problematic in TAA because trade adjustment assistance is not theoretically supposed to take care of, it's not supposed to finance degree programs, only vocational programs. So that's something that we also have to address. But these are all the things that I brought up before. This is the infrastructure catching up with the economic reality, and we have to really do that aggressively.
I think those are very insightful comments, and I appreciate the information on the part-time. It just made no sense to me that people are saying if I didn't need the loan or didn't need the TAA, if I had a full-time job, or if I had the time, I'd go full-time, but I don't have the time because I have to work. I need the money because I have to work. I mean, and we rule those folks out. It's kind of...
Excuse me, Mr. Congressman, if I can just say one other thing. I've been down in Kannapolis interviewing workers down there to see, going through the program, what it was like. Some of them said to me, you know, you've got this wonderful program, money and training and all this. I don't want it. I don't need it. All I need is the health coverage tax credit. I just want some assistance keeping my health care. But we don't allow them to do it. They have to take the whole package or nothing. So, I mean, there's another basic thing. And there, it would be so much more cost-effective if we allowed people a menu and let them pick and choose what they wanted instead of us putting them into some system where they have to take it all or leave it.
Is that in your testimony, Mr. Rosen? I don't know if it is.
In my written testimony.
Okay, thank you. I just had dinner over the break or the weekend with one of our employers at a shipyard, and I asked him, you know, how's business and what are your challenges? And I hear this from every employer I talk to. It's paradoxical given the topic here today. And the number one challenge is finding good workers. Finding people who will show up on time, pass the drug test, do the work, and stick with it is a nightmarish challenge for employers who are honest, who don't steal, etc. Now, I'm not trying to besmirch the majority of American workers, because I think most of people are hardworking, play by the rules, and are decent folks. But from the employers I talk to, finding people who will do the job and have the skills is a real challenge. Which prompts me to think out loud a little bit. The paradox of TAA is we're saying, okay, so after you've got your job, we're going to try to train you up for a new job. What I don't know is to what extent that issue is contributing to the outsourcing of jobs, that issue of difficulty finding workers. I think it's significant from employers I talk to. They many times are willing to pay fairly good wages and good benefits. Can't find the workers, and somebody else does have them. You're going to go there. One thought I had, and I don't know if this makes sense, but so let's suppose I'm an employer and I'm faced with some difficult financial decisions, and either I may offshore my work. I may keep the business running, but offshore it, and thereby close down a factory or mill or something in my district. Or I may just be going to go under because somebody else somewhere else is making, and the business is going to go belly up. In which case, either way, I lose local jobs. Is there any way that those folks can come forward and say, look, I'm about to go under, and dump about 300 workers onto your TAA rolls at a cost of X? If you just give me X in some fashion, I can keep my business open and you don't have to spend it on TAA. I don't think there's any way that I know of, but it sure makes a lot of sense to me. Or give me X minus 10%. It makes sense to me that we ought to find some way, sort of pre-TAA, to do TAA. I don't know how to work it, but I'd rather see people continue to work, the jobs continue, because once you shut these mills down, they're done. It gets turned into condos or scrapped out as scrap metal, and the jobs, the expertise goes, et cetera. I don't know if there's a way to do it, but any thoughts on that?
Congressman, I mentioned in my oral statement that there are currently two programs, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership that provides technical assistance.
I haven't been greatly impressed by that in my experience.
And the second is the Trade Adjustment Assistance for Firms program, which I know also has a center in Washington State. Now, in the history of the TA for Firms program, actually when it was started in 1974 and into the 1980s, it provided technical assistance, but there also was a loan guarantee part of that program. In the early 80s, that was removed. Maybe that decision needs to be revisited. But right now, those two programs provide only technical assistance and no financial assistance. But those kinds of programs should be studied and possibly expanded if they can if they can prevent those kinds of occurrences from happening. But the financial side is a totally separate thing.
The problem is there's something that economists call moral hazard, where if firms were allowed to do that, then they'd say, some of them, not all of them, would say they were going under in order to get grants from the state or the federal government. So that's one barrier to putting these things into place. About your employer in Washington State who can't find enough workers, you do see this in many parts of the country. You see some places that have a lot of workers and others that don't have enough. And if one could somehow encourage mobility, a lot of times people in communities just don't want to leave, but if they could somehow be persuaded to leave, then there are jobs elsewhere. If you look at the auto industries, for example, in Michigan versus auto plants in Alabama, there's a great deal of demand in Alabama, and there are unemployed workers in Michigan. So if we could figure out some way to transition them to other parts of the country, perhaps with grants or with wage substitution programs, then that might be helpful.
I think another sort of way to look at this discussion in trying to follow up with what Dr. Pally talked about is about the race to the bottom. And I'll give you another kind of concrete example. There's an automobile supplier in our area that has a low wage, can pay $10 an hour, and they're making wiring harnesses. Okay? Our local paper just reported that they're losing anywhere from 12 to 15 workers a month. They're rolling over the workforce. Now, you can do that in a grocery store, but if you're making wiring harnesses for an automobile, there's going to be problems down the road with your wiring harnesses in your car. Because the wages are dropping to such levels that people won't take those jobs. Or if they do take those jobs, their relationship to that job is very tenuous at best. And so I think part of this larger question is about this race to the bottom that's occurring as a result of this, that's increasing steadily, not just in terms of the wage rates itself, but now the shifting of risk to employees in terms of health care, pensions, etc., and which makes it very difficult. Those workers that are making the $10 an hour, they're not getting health care. Okay, and so and they can shift between jobs at that $8 to $12 an hour range. That's $24,000 at the high point there. And if you have to buy health insurance, the disposable income is enormously low. So I think you're going to have a lot of that. I think you're going to have a lot of turnover in the workforce. Some people praise that. Some people think that's disastrous, not only in terms of the individual, but in terms of product in the long run.
Do we have some figures in terms of what the average cost per employee, the average net cost? I mean, I'm assuming, so not just the TAA expenditures, but health care. You know, let's suppose you got an employee who becomes eligible for TAA. And so they've lost their job, they've lost their health care, and they're going to get subsidized there possibly, who knows what. Has somebody done the math, some sharp economist, and said, so, you know, this is what they'd be eligible for TAA, this is what their health care costs are?
Well, I'm not sure this is exactly what you're looking for, and I'm certainly not a bright economist, but we've looked at the amount of money spent on trade adjustment assistance per person, and that comes out to about $15,000. Now, that includes the extended unemployment insurance payments for probably about a year, because that's the average of what people are taking, plus the training, plus there's a wage insurance program, plus the health coverage tax credit. This doesn't tell me the out-of-pocket expenses of the worker, but the amount that we're paying, the 65% that the federal government's paying. So that's about $15,000, as opposed to under the WIA program, the Workforce Investment Act, which is the general training program for all dislocated workers. It's $600. $600, I shouldn't say it because I have an expert sitting next to me. At a community college, that doesn't probably even pay for one single course. So that's what we pay on average for WIA, and on the other hand, we pay $15,000, and it's a high number because that includes the income maintenance payments under trade adjustment assistance.
Appreciate the insightful comments. Mr. Chairman, I have another appointment, but I appreciate you calling this hearing. Thanks to our witnesses.
Thank you. And we are at the end of the time that we had scheduled the hearing. I have hours more questions prepared by the subcommittee's able staff, not to mention the questions that would spring from our own fertile brain, which are usually a nightmare for the staff. But I appreciate all of you being here. This is obviously a hugely important topic that will be with us for a long time. Thank you all for appearing before the subcommittee this afternoon. And under the rules of the committee, the record will be held open for 2 weeks for members to submit additional statements and any additional questions they might have for the witnesses, which can be answered in writing, of course. And the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much.